Greetings and salutations, friends! Today we're going to be talking about two of the likely legendary lords that we will be seeing in Total War Warhammer 2, one of which has already been confirmed, that being Teclis, High Lore Master of Hoth and the Warden of the White Tower, and almost certainly we're also going to be seeing his moody brother, Tyrion, heir of Venarian and the Defender of Ulthuan. These two characters are an odd lot. They are two of those classical heroes that have fallen into that most obvious of classical hero traps, with simply just not being particularly human. These two characters are both in desperate need of even the slightest little hint of humanity, since even their failings only really serve to make them even more cartoonishly comic book virtuous. I mean, for fuck's sake, Tyrion's beginning story is essentially him leaping in front of a pretty girl and taking a wound to the shoulder. You don't get much more fucking cliched than that. And of course, then there is his poor, frail brother, who is just barely kept alive by the magical powers of shit tons of cash. But of course, inevitably grows to be the classical mind-over-matter hero. A frail body, but a strong mind, and all of that nonsense. And both of them, of course, go on to be the saviors of the elven race, cutting down bajillions upon millions of token bad guys, killing demons, saving the world, and doing all kinds of magical nonsense. Hell, Teclis can literally just wipe out armies by snapping his fucking fingers together, and Tyrion has taken on greater goddamn demons with a broken fucking chair leg. And that isn't even mentioning the fact that he cucked the Phoenix King out of his Ever-Queen. Now, granted, in all due technicality, the Phoenix King only really has to fuck the Ever-Queen once, and then just go on back to his harem, but still, getting his de facto queen stolen by an up-jumped noble from a minor clan of distant heritage of Venarian must sting just a tiny little bit, even though the End Times eventually decided that the reason for this is that Finnewar's been dead in his room for the last 275 fucking years, and nobody bothered to fucking check on him. But that is of course part of the Age of Fucking timeline, and as usual I will do my absolute best to ignore that as hard as supporters of the wage gap theory ignore reality. What I'm basically trying to say is that Tyrion and Teclis are the perfect high elf characters, not even the slightest hint of humanity, and they are the most insufferable little twatwits you will ever run into in a fantasy space. And to their credits, every single author that has ever depicted them in book form seems to be fully aware of this, and strive diligently to make them the least sympathetic characters ever imagined since Theon Greyjoy and Judas. Hell, I even have a perfect example of this very thing. In a Gotrek and Felix novel, we are introduced to a glistening lightly with sparkly sweat Teclis as he stands naked on the balcony of his massive tower mansion right after he has finished banging a pair of gorgeous high elf twins into moaning and sighing submission on his magical featherbed of endless O-phase. After which he proceeds to waffle on about his left eye aching and sensing a disturbance in the Force, and proceeds then to butt-fuck his way into the plot in a way only slightly less tearing and traumatic than a lumberyard gang rape. Part of me even admires how utterly unlikable either of these two head-wing-wearing muffins are, since it is undeniably high-elf in nature, but as the bear said to the bound naked man covered in grill sauce and honey, you just put it on too damn thick. But now that I have made my dislike for the characters abundantly obvious, I shall get on with the actual point and present you their backstory, so that you may also come to dislike them as ferociously as I do. So let's start at the beginning. Tyrion and Teclis were birthed to Prince Erathian, a rather scholarly sort, that had dedicated his entire life, and much of his fortune, to restoring the armour of the Phoenix King Venarian, the very first Phoenix King. Their mother died conveniently in childbirth, and their father was busy poking around on the armour, so they were essentially raised by the family's butler. Although their daddy did at least pay some attention to Teclis, his youngest and frailest son. He spent a ginormous amount of money buying various magical potions and other such convenient doodahs to keep the child alive. Meanwhile, of course, Tyrion was climbing mountains and shit and being generally energetic and wonderful, strong, powerful, charismatic, perfect, basically. Personally, I'm vaguely surprised that one or the other didn't simply stab his opposite number, because they seem to have every possible reason to hate each other's guts. Teclis would hate Tyrion for being perfect, athletic, beautiful, charming, la-ba-di-la-ba-di-la-ba-di-la, essentially being everything that he isn't, and Tyrion should absolutely despise Teclis because he was hogging practically all of the tiny spare time that their father actually had to give them. But this never really seems to factor into their relationships to any real degree. I guess it would have made them a little bit too interesting. Anyways, as I mentioned, Teclis was probably closest to their father, and their father brought him in to help work on the armour of Venarian. Now, I'd like to ask the question as to how much help an infirm child could possibly be with fixing an armour crafted by a god, but oh well, minor details. Eventually, however, both Tyrion and Teclis were brought to the Phoenix King's court, as is the tradition between elf nobles, to be raised as a ward of the state. This is where the two really started getting some fame and fortune. And it should also be mentioned that coming of age for an elf is considerably different than coming of age as a human. The two were probably at the very least decades old, and probably maybe even centuries, at the point where they were considered to be adults within elven communities. And they were both rather pointedly referred to as youngsters by many of the other elves, so by elven standards, they were probably, well, young, but by human standards, they could very likely have been very, very old indeed. Now, the two, having rather different talents, were sent to different places. Teclis was sent to the White Tower to learn and master the mysteries of magic. But, of course, being one of the classical overpowered main character protagonists, Teclis pretty much already knew everything they had to teach him, so that was kind of a waste of time. To the point that, later on, the Guardian of the White Tower gave him several of their most powerful and revered artifacts to a young acolyte, because the Master of the White Tower just saw great potential in the young whippersnapper. Because, of course, why not? Tyrion, being a handsome young lad, was sent off to the Everqueen's court to be a gigolo, or wait, no, bodyguard, technically, but, well, that is the most technical of technicalities. If nothing else, High Elf society could be said to be very, very gender equal, since both the Queen and the King had their own little harems. And just in case one, or indeed both of the two monarchs were to swing the other way, the Everqueen has a bodyguard of maidens, and the Phoenix King has, of course, his bodyguard of fluffy little white lions. The two-legged variety. Don't get me wrong, wait, actually, no, let's not complete that thought, shall we? Moving swiftly along, what would two heroes be without a little bit of a calamity of evil? And this is where the great storm of chaos sweeps into center stage. The humans would refer to this as the First Great War against Chaos, or indeed, the Great War against Chaos. For the elves, however, this was but one of many. They had fought the force of chaos several times previously. However, this time was to be a little bit special, since this time they were not fighting purely the forces of chaos, but also their degenerate brethren. The divide between the two High Elf factions of those who followed the Phoenix King and those that followed Malekith had happened relatively recently in High Elf history. Now, there had been invasions both ways before this Great War of Chaos, but this was the first time that Malekith the Witch King allied himself fully to the forces of Chaos, with the goal in mind, of course, of conquering Ulthuan. And as with all things properly Dark Elf in nature, the invasion came upon the High Elves as unexpectedly and unwelcome as the feel of a winky against your lower back in a dark alley, and with much the same outcome. The High Elves were routed in virtually every single early engagement, and this disaster was in no small part due to the first blow struck by their degenerate cousins, for they aimed that very first strike against the Everqueen herself. And it was said that she had been assassinated and her maiden guard slaughtered. It is important to remember also the sheer psychological effect that such a loss would have upon the High Elves. The Ever-Queen was an extremely important political and religious figure. She was a linchpin of both state and church, and in many ways she represented the unity of Ulthuan in a way that the Phoenix King could not. The Phoenix King might be their commander-in-chief, but the Ever-Queen was the soul of Ulthuan, and her sudden death left a rather permanent scar upon the High Elves. However, there were some that would not believe that she was dead. One of those was Teclis, because he knew that his brother Tyrion, as overpowered as he was nearby the Queen, and he also felt that if his brother were to have been slain, he would almost certainly have known about it. As such, he set out to find his brother and, by extension, the Ever-Queen. It was in relation to this quest that he was given the War Crown of Saphiri, one of the most potent magical artifacts in the White Tower, and not usually something you give to an acolyte, but, again, main character and all that. And his brotherly bond with Tyrion would prove to be a remarkably accurate metric. It turned out that Tyrion had butchered his way out of the Dark Elf ambush, manfully dragging the Ever-Queen behind him while slaughtering half a dozen of Malekith's finest assassins. He hauled her off into the forest to do God only knows what. Protect her, I'm sure. But he wasn't the stealthiest of bastards, considering the fact that he usually wears brightly polished silver armour that gleams in the moonlight like the biggest fuck me right here button in the history of video games. That is not a particularly huge surprise. He was discovered by a band of Dark Elf assassins, and while Tyrion quickly dispatched every last bloody one of them, they did manage to send off a messenger, which found Malekith. Malekith now knew where the High Elf and the Ever-Queen was holed up, and sent a greater demon of Slaanesh, a keeper of secrets, to take care of the annoying little hero, and to do unmentionable things to the poor little queen. And no matter how good Tyrion is with that pointy stick of his, mere swords are not going to be doing a whole lot of damage against a greater demon, and one of Slaanesh is more likely to take pleasure from being repeatedly stabbed with a sharp pointy object rather than any sort of pain or displeasure. This, of course, all meant that Tyrion was up Tentacle Creek without a paddle, and about to get his second virginity taken in the most violent way imaginable, and that is the moment where his brother showed up and hauled his tiny little and yet virgin ass out of the demonic fire. Because while good old-fashioned steel is unlikely to do a whole lot of damage to a Slaaneshi greater demon, a fireball shoved violently and suddenly up its ass from behind is a vastly different sort of thing indeed. And Teclis, being a very, very gifted youngster, and wearing the Crown of Saphiri, didn't have much problems defeating one, and most likely a very, very surprised greater demon. And so the Ever-Queen was rescued and the brothers reunited, but the overall situation was not looking particularly good for the High Elves. They had been routed on virtually every single front. The Dark Elves had made it as far as the Blighted Isles, although they could not interfere with it directly as of yet, due to the warding spells. In Saphiri, the White Tower managed to hold out against the incoming invaders, mostly due to the power of their mages, and the fortress city of Lothran was also able to hold the invaders at bay. The Phoenix King himself was trapped inside the city, and there was little hope of them breaking out unless assisted from outside forces. And of those outside forces, there just wasn't a whole lot. Most of the larger garrisons and concentrations of the High Elves' armies had been wiped out in the early days of the invasion, their fortresses taken over, many by treachery and subterfuge, and the various war hosts scattered throughout Ulthuan under the command of individual lords or military commanders had been prevented from gathering up in any significant numbers, and had been destroyed piecemeal by the invaders. The High Elves' mighty fleet had mostly been caught also completely unaware. The Dark Elf Black Arks had been able to make landfall with little to no resistance, and it was from these mighty ships that many of the precision strikes of the early days were launched. After that, the High Elf fleet found themselves separated from their own lands by blockades of Dark Elf arks and ships, and with much of the land fallen to the Dark Elves' armies, the mighty High Elf fleet could do little but stand off the coast and protect whatever they could. They still fared the sea around the Blighted Isle, and they could keep up at least a halfway efficient blockade of some of the Dark Elves' reinforcements, but for all intents and purposes, the High Elf navy had with one single chess move been put almost entirely out of the equation. And as for Ulthuan's greatest defenders, the Dragon Princes of Caledor, while attempts were made to raise the slumbering dragons, they were mostly ineffective. The dragons, although being magical creatures, are not creatures of chaos, at the very least not direct creatures of chaos, like for example demons. They do draw a fair amount of power from magic, and if the world had more magic, they as well would be more effective. However, it is important to remember that, first and foremost, the dragons were, in all due essentiality, enslaved to the High Elves, and much of their power was tied up in this binding contract, forged by the Father of Dragons and Caledor the Dragon Tamer. This, along with their proximity to the Vortex and the Vortex's overall effects on the world, meant that the dragons were slowly but surely slipping deeper into slumber, until one day they could no longer be raised at all. And in this particular instance, very, very few of the dragons, and only the youngest, could be brought out of their slumber. And even worse, it takes a very long time to wake a dragon. The times when the dragons were just roaming the landscape are long gone. Even the raising of a single, relatively young dragon would probably take weeks, and raising one of the older star dragons could take months, if not years, time which the High Elves simply did not possess. As for our intrepid heroes, they were now travelling through a land almost entirely controlled by the Dark Elves. The High Elves had been reduced to fighting a guerrilla war within their own kingdom. Eventually, Teclis guided his brother and the Everqueen to the shores of the Inner Sea, where they were picked up by the remnants of the High Elves' navy, and indeed some of the Queen's guard had also survived and were picked up alongside them. The ships carried them to the plain of Finual, where the shattered remnants of the various elven armies and garrisons were gathering for one last final stand against the, at this point, overwhelming might of the Dark Elf armies. But before we get to the final climactic battles, our heroes need their reward for saving the damsel and the brother in distress. For Tyrion, the Everqueen had a heart-shaped brooch, which contained some wonderful little magical power that would protect him and bring him back safely. Now, whether or not this was simply a piece of metal or something with actual power is not necessarily pointed out specifically, but considering Tyrion's rule set, we can assume that this was probably a little bit more than a keepsake. He was also gifted with a magical sword specifically forged to fight against demons, which, considering recent events, is probably a pretty damn good idea, everything considered. His father also had been brought to the army encampment, and he bestowed the armour of Anarion upon the young Tyrion. Now, granted, the armour was not yet completely mended, but it was good enough for human needs. After all, this was a suit of armor forged by a god for the use of a demigod that was channeling another god. It was a rather splendid piece, and even if it was not at its full potential, that was still more than enough to protect him from any human blade. And finally, in gratitude for saving their queen, the elves of Illyrian presented Tyrion with their finest steed, Malahandir, the last living example of the bloodline of Corhandir, the father of all horses. And as for Teclis, he was gifted the Staff of Lilith. Its overflowing magical power granted him enough strength and fortitude to actually not die without his potions, which for Teclis was a first. He refused the offer of any magical swords, however, preferring instead one of his own making, a sword that he has forged part of his very soul into. And so, with a generous dollop of XP and some GM handout weapons, the two brothers were ready to face their mortal foe, Malekith the Witch King, in his full splendor, with his army arrayed for battle. And Malekith had brought friends. One entire flank of his army was made up by monstrous Chaos Knights, mounted upon their demonic steeds. As for the rest of the army, it was a Dark Elf host in all of its shadowy glory. Ranks upon ranks of black armoured spearmen, supported by ranks upon ranks of repeater ball throwers and crossbowmen. And furthermore, the Dark Elves brought their own little touch to the classical High Elf battle lines, with vast monstrosities like hydras and many other mystical and magical beings lined up ready to thunder into the High Elf lines. And facing the noble silver helms of the High Elf army were hordes of Cold Ones, mounted by cruel and wicked Dark Elf knights. And standing triumphantly above them all was Malekith the Witch King himself, a rather ridiculous force multiplier by his lonesome. He had also brought with him his favoured champion, Urien Poisonblade. And by the way, a quick note on Urien. He's a funny little fella. He's a part of the more old-school fluff, as you can probably tell by the picture of him. He was raised from but a little child by the Witch King himself to become his personal champion, and as you can probably guess, considering his tutelage, he was pretty damn good at it. He would travel around the lands of Nagaroth and even beyond, going from master to master, and upon first meeting them, he would tell them that he would kill them upon learning everything that they could possibly teach, unless they could kill him first. And so he did, for a very, very long time. And he was, of course, also a Dark Elf at heart. I mean, considering who raised him, in all due technicality, that's no huge surprise. He was said to be one of the cruelest, most assholey little torturous douche nozzles in the entirety of the Dark Elf realm, which is quite saying something. And he had a funny little story going around him in the old Dark Elf fluff books. Basically, he had a saying going around him that if you were captured by Urien, you were best off to swallow your tongue and choke on it rather than survive to be captured and tortured. After this, Urien ordered that all of his captives have their tongues cut out. I don't know why I find that so funny. It's just the sheer petulance in the act is enough to make me giggle slightly. But that is, of course, all entirely besides the point. Urien called out to the High Elf army, laid out in battle array before him, and demanded that they send their champions to fight him. And so they did, because High Elves are stupid and honourable and all of that shit. So they sent several champions, in fact. First, Arhalion of Ivres, who was cut down in mere instance. He's supposedly kind of competent, at least so the sourcebook tells us, but, well, clearly not. The next one was a captain of the White Lions, Corian Ironglaive, who at least managed to fight him for a couple of minutes before he got his head chopped off. And then, finally, Tyrion strode forth, put the assassin over his knee, and spanked him ferociously in front of the entire army. Well, granted, that's not entirely what happened, but, I mean, come on now. You've got Tyrion, the literal White Knight in shining armour, mounted upon a horse so white that it's practically glow in the fucking dark, with a heart-shaped brooch bestowed upon him by a queen in love mere moments ago. Is there anyone here that has seen a Disney movie? Anyone? Because if you have, you probably know what's coming. Now, granted, the book tried to make it interesting, saying that the two exchanged blows faster than the eye could see and all that, but, well, Tyrion stabbed him through the heart and he fell over dead. And luckily for the High Elves, the Dark Elves had never before seen a Disney movie, and so this particular plot twist caught them entirely unawares. They stood there shocked for a moment before charging towards the lone elf warrior in a fit of rage before they could be properly organized. This ferocious rush of Dark Elf warriors completely shattered their pristine formations, and gave the High Elves a massive advantage in the early engagements. Now, you might ask, what happened to Tyrion? Did he get overwhelmed by 100 100,000 Dark Elves? No, of course not. He manly stood his ground and slaughtered the first couple hundred to reach him, because, well, Tyrion. And in all due probability, the battle was won right then and there. If the Dark Elves had simply calmly and collectedly, with disciplined ranks, advanced upon the High Elves, they could probably have crushed them beneath an endless grinding tread of heavily armoured warriors and never-ending waves of repeater crossbow bolts. But their unorganized charge gave the High Elves enough time to meet them in full formations. It also allowed them to get off most of their own ammunition while getting protected from the enemy's ammunition by the closeness of their enemies. Now, granted, Dark Elves don't give particularly much of a fig's ass about shooting friendlies in the back, but they, unlike Skavens, at least have to pretend that they care, and as such, they would usually not engage directly with enemies in the line of fire. They probably did so frequently anyways, but at the very least the High Elves had Dark Elves to hide behind, or, well, hide in front of in all due technicality. The giant melee lasted for a full day and into the early night, with Tyrion riding around on his gleaming white stallion, murdering Dark Elves by the bucket loads, because, again, Tyrion. Teclis was otherwise occupied, which we will get to in a moment. However, the Dark Elf host outnumbered the High Elves to an absolutely hilarious degree, and while their unorganized charge had given the High Elves the opportunity to fight on their terms, that was in all due essentiality only a delaying action. It will hold the headsman's axe at bay for a while, but defeat still seemed all but certain. No matter how many hundreds of Dark Elves Tyrion ripped to shreds with his magical sword, and no matter how many dozens more were trampled beneath the hooves of his glowing white horse, there was just a lot of Dark Elves, and Tyrion could not be everywhere at once. Sooner or later, the Dark Elves would find some place to break through the organized High Elf lines, and then the slaughter would commence in earnest. However, this is where his brother comes into the picture. At this point, the High Elf army would already have been completely and utterly incinerated if it were not for Teclis. The Witch King would be more than able to wipe a paltry army like this off the face of the earth with a mere snap of his fingers. However, Teclis was somehow managing to hold back the Witch King's power. And again, I remind you, the Witch King is probably the most powerful magic user in the Warhammer world, except perhaps for Lord Croak himself, and a direct descendant of Anarion. The dude essentially has God's blood running through his veins. Not to mention the simple fact that the bastard has been alive for the last 10,000 odd years, with nothing else to do but constantly brood upon how he was betrayed by the Shiny Ones, and practice the two M's, masturbation and magic. And one would honestly think that he would be vastly superior to a relative youngster as Teclis in both arts. But clearly that was not the case, as first Teclis managed to keep Malekith at bay, and finally he called upon his trump card. Drawing strength directly from the Staff of Lilith, he conjured up one single titanically powerful burst of magical energies, and threw it towards the Witch King. Desperately, he tried to avoid it, but could not, and was struck full on by the full might of an elven goddess. This was more than even Malekith could handle, and again, this is one of those little plot point thingies. If Malekith was actually the Phoenix King chosen by the flames of Assyrian, then Lilith's flames really should not be able to hurt him too much, but in this case, it was enough to burn his very soul, just like the flames of Anarion apparently did, and before he was completely destroyed, he had to throw himself into the maelstrom of the warp to preserve himself. Which doesn't really make sense if you take into account the fucking, but, well, we're going to be trying to avoid that, as previously mentioned, so let us just simply ignore that particular dark armoured elephant in the room and move onwards. Now, the Dark Elf army was caught between two vastly over-leveled Morrowind characters. One mage that had put a little bit too many points in spellcrafting and probably one or two cheats as well, and one warrior that unlocked the full potential of alchemy within that particularly wonderful little RPG. Caught between two such overwhelmingly overpowered main characters, the Dark Elf army could do nothing but break and flee to be cut down in their thousands by the vengeful High Elves, and honestly, who can blame them? Have you seen the goddamn stat lines on those two bastards? And that is before we take into account their rather ridiculous exploits in the various fluff, with Teclis wiping out entire goddamn armies and defeating entire covenants of sorcerers single-handedly, and Tyrion, of course, cutting his way through entire armies with not so much as a scratch. With this great defeat, the Dark Elves' hold on the southern lands of Ulthuan was completely and utterly broken, as was the siege of Lothran. It now had a High Elf army directly to its rear, and its overall commander had taken a little dip in the warp pool and would not be available for quite some time. This meant that the Phoenix King was free to once again lead his troops into battle, and a course of action was swiftly decided upon. The Phoenix King would take half of his army up one side of the Isle of Ulthuan, while Tyrion would lead the other, and they would finally meet at the full halfway point in Chrace, after having driven out the Dark Elves. There was still a fair bit of fierce fighting to be had, and some particularly nasty ones in the mountainous regions, but with the aid of the recently roused dragons and the leadership of the Phoenix King and Tyrion both, the Dark Elves were eventually driven from the lands of Ulthuan after 2 long years of campaigning. Skirmishes would continue on the Isle for many decades to come, but this signified the end of the Dark Elf invasion of Ulthuan during the Great War against Chaos. Teclis, however, was not there to see this triumph. Before the 2 High Elf armies, one under the command of the Phoenix King and the other under Tyrion, had departed, a battered ship came into the port of Lothran, bearing an ambassador from the Empire, seeking the High Elves' aid. Kislev had all but been overrun by the forces of Chaos, and the Empire was in desperate need of aid, magical aid to be precise. Teclis, as well as 2 of his friends from the White Tower of Hoeth, decided to go and aid the men of the Empire. Undoubtedly, the Empire was a little bit miffed to see 3 High Elves, where they had expected a host, but what they received in return was the 3 greatest mages of the High Elf lands, or, well, the greatest mage and 2 random school buddies. However, the power of Teclis should not be underestimated. His magical aid brought considerable amounts of firepower to the Empire armies. He also gave the gift of magic to the lands of men. Teclis was essentially the founder of the colleges of magic in Altdorf, and granted them an even greater gift. The art of manipulating magic is based upon manipulating the very winds of magic themselves, being essentially chaos. To do this, but to keep the wizard safe from chaotic influences, certain tools, wardings, and mental influences are necessary. These are usually worked into glyphs, runes, or words of power, to shield the soul of the user from the rather pernicious influence of the warp. Now, the High Elves' own system was far too complex to be grasped by the minds of mere monkeys, and so Teclis devised a brand new magical language for the humans to learn and to utilize. They would never be able to call upon the full arts of magic like the High Elves could, but they would be able to use enough, and specifically, they would be able to use magic that goes boom and bang, which is pretty much what all the monkeys need anyways. After the events of the Great War against Chaos, the 2 brothers were eventually reunited, although they would not stay together for long. Their paths were very, very different. Teclis would grow to be the High Lawmaster of the Tower of Hoeth, and would continue his research into many magical arts, until eventually the events of the Fucking happened, which we shan't be covering here. Tyrion took a very, very different path. Rather than devoting himself to unselfish studies, he rose quickly within the aristocracy of the High Elves. He was even rumoured to have certain ambitions of his very own, perhaps even going so far as the Phoenix Crown its very self. But if Tyrion had any such ambitions, he kept them very, very secret indeed. There certainly was some whisperings that he was not entirely fond of the current Phoenix King and his somewhat hesitant way of leadership, but Tyrion was far too dutiful a soldier to ever outright oppose his lord. Other than, of course, than fucking his wife, frequently, and with great vigour, but hey, details. And that has been my lore video on Tyrion and Teclis. I'm thinking that in the game we're going to be seeing two very, very different characters. We're going to be seeing the Prince Tyrion, mounted upon his mighty steed, being able to just slice his merry little way through entire goddamn armies, if he's represented even halfway correctly, while regenerating hit points and doing all kinds of magical stuff. And God help you if you send demons in his general direction. As for Teclis, well, magic in Warhammer Total War tends to be a little bit underwhelming, but I'm thinking Teclis should probably have something unique to him. Definitely the High Elves is of course going to have access to their high magic, and I imagine Teclis could be very, very annoying if they port over certain ridiculously shitty spells, like for example the ability to simply break your enemy's magical items. There has been some salt mined from that particular ability, I can tell you that much, and while I think that would probably be a little bit too cuntish of an ability to put in a Total War game, it would nevertheless be rather interesting if you could at the very least seal the magical abilities of certain enemy heroes and champions for a limited duration. And of course he should be able to fling plenty of fireballs all over the battlefield and regenerate magic like nobody's goddamn business. But we will have to wait and see. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.